Good evening and welcome everyone to Timbro. My name is Håkan Trebell. I'm Director of Ideas here at Timbro. And in just a minute I will let Fredrik Segerfeldt take charge of this evening. But before that I just want to say a few words about today's special guest. It is a real privilege to welcome William Easterly. Perhaps Professor Easterly doesn't need much of an introduction. You have, after all, more than once been on Foreign Policy's well-known ranking of top 100 global thinkers. But I'll just mention a few lines from your bio anyway. William Easterly is Professor of Economics at the New York University and co-director at the Development Research Institute. He's published more than 60 peer-reviewed academic articles and has authored a couple of books: The Elusive Quest for Growth, Economists' Adventures and Misadventures in the Tropics, and of course the well-known The White Man's Burden, Why the West's Efforts to aid the rest have done so much harm and so little good. And actually you can buy the Swedish version, Den vite mannens börda, outside here at a very special rate tonight. So take that opportunity. It's a recommendation. Bill, it's really great to have you here at Timbro. Fredrik, take it from here.
Thank you. I'm a bit starstruck because William Easterly has been one of my most important idols. My girlfriend told me that I've heard the name Easterly more often than the name Johan, which is my brother's name. So I'm not a stalker, but anyway. I'm a bit nervous, but it's really great to have you here. My first question is going to be on the topics of planners versus searchers, which is the point of departure, sort of. In the book, The White Man's Burden. You talk about planners and searchers, and development has always taken place as a result of efforts by searchers, as a bottom-up trial and error process. But foreign aid, and in particular it's the way it's constructed or thought of by international aid agencies and national aid agencies, by definition is, almost by definition, a planned process.
Yeah.
So is this the main problem with aid? And what do you mean by searchers and planners? And is the same reason why aid cannot work in that way the same reason why command economies don't work?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the idea of a planner is just that the solution to development is thought to be something that you can just write down, like a recipe for pancakes or something, that you just, you put in so much milk and so much flour, and actually I haven't made pancakes in a long time, so I forget the recipe, but I think I used Bisquick mix, which in the US you just add the milk and then it instantly makes pancakes. But anyway, that's a very easy recipe, but people often think of the answer to development as being a recipe like that you just write down a list of ingredients and you're done. Then the planner just implements the recipe, the set of technical instructions. You give bed nets for malaria, you create nitrogen-producing leguminous plants. I didn't make up these words. I'm copying them from planners to help fertilize the fields. You have water purification tablets to make clean water, and you just list all these technical requirements, and then you've solved all the problems and you're done. Now, of course, that's not really how any of us in rich countries see our problems solved, and it's not an accident. That's because that way of solving problems just doesn't work, and there are several reasons. First, the plan can never be completely specified, and this is the thing that's in common with central planning that you mentioned, that you can never have enough knowledge to give the exact recipe. You always have to adjust the recipe to some set of local circumstances and fix the bugs that go wrong. You always have to adapt. It's just universal. So, for example, bed nets seem like a very easy answer to malaria. What can be easier? You sleep and they're given out for free to pregnant women and small children, and especially in Africa, which is the main region of risk, and those pregnant women and small children are the main risk group, and you have the women and children sleep under the bed net. Some mosquitoes can't get to them. They don't get malaria. Malaria is solved where it's done. Well, alas, if it were, I really wish it were that easy. Let me make one thing clear, is that the people who criticize the way aid is presently done are not, like me and like many others, are not criticizing it because we disagree with the objectives. Of course, we want the poverty to end. I want to go on record that I'm really completely against malaria. I'm totally opposed to malaria. Just really ready to debate with those people who are for malaria. But I want the solution to malaria to work, that's all. And it doesn't work because various things go wrong. What can go wrong? Well, what usually goes wrong is that there's always some missing element that you overlook. So for example, health education is a big problem in Africa. People, for good reason, have not been convinced by experience that the scientific model of medicine in which mosquitoes transmit malaria and can be prevented by bed nets really works. And when I say for good reason, it's partly because, the reason we really, all of us, believe in the scientific theory of medicine and follow doctors' recommendations is we do have health systems that mostly work for us, and we've seen them work in practice. So, I've never read how many people in here have read health science textbooks to decide how to care for your personal health? I mean, not the real technical health science none of us read the textbooks. We do it because our health system works for us. And so, what goes wrong in this solution is that with a malfunctioning health system, which is ironically, this is kind of a vicious circle, because the health system is malfunctioning, because everything in it is planned, and there is no adaptation of the kind that I'm talking about. So people don't believe in scientific medicine, and then people don't accept the bed nets. They don't want to sleep under them because they're hot, and also there are some attractive alternative uses, like they're very good as fishing nets, it turns out. So there's a thriving market in fishing nets using malaria bed nets. And so, this is the kind of thing and people who have actually been out in the field trying to do development, and I'm not claiming vast amounts of field experience, but working for an agency like the World Bank does give you enough of exposure to these problems that that you have to search for the answer, that you always have to adapt and search. Then that brings us to our second problem, which is if the technical plans involve people, then those people have to have incentives. And incentives are really at the heart of why aid is not performing up to expectations. Because incentives rely on a virtuous feedback loop that is almost completely absent, very sadly so, in aid. Which is that you try something, you have to get accurate information on whether it worked or not from the intended beneficiaries, the people you were trying to help, the pregnant women and the small children, and those who care about them. And then, so you have to know whether it worked or not, and then you have to have accountability, in that you have to feel the motivation to act upon that knowledge, that if something is failing, I'm going to correct it. If something is succeeding, I'm going to do more of it. Unfortunately, that's not the mentality of aid. The mentality of aid is aid agencies are rewarded for the volume of the aid they give, not for the results that they get with the aid. Getting accurate feedback from the intended beneficiaries, it costs a lot. It takes a lot of time, a lot of trouble. They would rather cut back on that area and just keep dispersing the aid. And that is what they get politically rewarded for. They say, well, we're spending 0.7% of GDP on aid. We're wonderful. We're saintly. We've done the job. The problem is solved. But that's the central missing problem, that you have aid agencies that are not accountable for results. And if we have time in a subsequent question, I'll give you a couple of specific examples of aid agencies not being accountable. So.
Thanks for that. You also talk about, which is related to the first question, talk about rich people having markets and poor people having bureaucrats. And especially from a Swedish perspective, I have the impression that most people seem to think of rich countries as welfare states. More us than you guys, but still, their public expenditure for social benefits is much higher in the US than in Africa. And therefore, rich countries are more to the left. And poor countries are non-welfare states, and therefore they're being more capitalist. This is one of the ideas that float around in the debate here, at least. This, of course, is nonsense, because you can still be very capitalist and still have a welfare state. And if you compare Sweden, for example, and according to our level of economic freedom, to Latin America and Africa, Sweden is actually more capitalist than all these countries except for Mauritius, Botswana, and Chile, which also happen to be the 3 countries that are performing the best in this region. From this perspective, you claim that the rich have markets, whereas the poor have bureaucrats. The solution then to poverty should then be the promotion of more economic freedom to poor countries. But given your reasoning that there's no one path to development approach, I mean, how can we then promote economic freedom if there is no central planning? I mean, and you cannot centrally plan a free economy.
Right.
So there's an inherent contradiction here in that.
Right.
And is that the reason why economic freedom is not on the development agenda?
Yeah, yeah. So, people think that the argument, people, have this tendency to kind of keep repeating the same arguments over and over again, and to assign any new people to come along to the same boxes as the previous arguments. So there's been this debate going on forever that is sort of caricatured as the state versus market, right? So that, some people say the state should intervene a lot, and other people say leave everything to the market. And these are often, people often go to extreme positions, that one side is saying the state should do almost everything, the other side is saying don't have the state do anything, leave everything to the market. Now, I don't think that's quite the accurate way to think about the world. Because, and here's kind of the classic example of this. If you include in the state the aid agencies as well are sort of like pseudo-states for the developing world, because they have some power to dictate to, let's say, Bolivia. The World Bank has some power to dictate to Bolivia what Bolivia should do. And that can very well include another recipe, another plan, in which the plan is to implement the free market. And like you said, this is contradictory. So you have here, do you call this like a pro-state argument or a pro-market argument, where you have, the state, a very powerful state actor from the top down, trying to impose by force, by outside coercion, a plan which may be very very poorly informed as to how to adjust to Bolivian realities. A plan for making a very rapid transition from where Bolivia is at now to a free market society, in which the planners in this case are proposing all kinds of specific changes in Bolivian laws and Bolivian institutions. And they may be so, and because of these poor incentives that I talked about before and the lack of accountability, they don't have that much incentive to be that well informed. Chances are the plan they're proposing for Bolivia by both the IMF and the World Bank is the same one they imposed on Zambia and the same one they imposed on Afghanistan and other, culturally similar countries to Bolivia. So it's likely not to fit. Just like the malaria bednet plan didn't work, it's like you receive one of these kits in the mail where you can, construct your own tent or something, and you receive instructions how to assemble it. It's like the World Bank and the IMF is sending a kit to Bolivia. Here's how to assemble a free market. Put this thing here, put this thing here, and it's just as poorly informed as the malaria plan was. So that's the sense in which it's not as simple as just state versus market, because also the state versus market question leaves out one other very important aspect of individual freedom, which is political rights and democracy. So it's this combination of sort of economic freedoms that include the freedom to trade, but also political freedoms that include the opportunity to make your own decisions for yourself, to decide for yourself the things that affect you. This is the combination that works. And this outside coercion is really violating democracy. And what it does, very predictably, and it's exactly what it did in Bolivia and many other Latin American countries, is it created this huge backlash. So in the end, Bolivia wound up much less market-oriented than it was before as a result of all this. So the ruler that the IMF and the World Bank were imposing by sort of external coercion, this plan to do the market on, was named Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada. He was pushed out of office by the current ruler. I'm blanking out on Morales.
Evo Morales.
Evo Morales. He was pushed out by Evo Morales, who was very anti-market. And Evo Morales had a wonderful democratic platform. Of course, democracy is not just about majority vote elections, but he had been handed a wonderful platform of resisting the evil foreigners who are imposing things on Bolivians. And that's a platform that enabled him to get rid of Sanchez de Lozada and turn Bolivia even more against the market. So freedom is not an ideological thing which belongs either to the right or to the left. And it's not so easily divisible between economic and political freedoms. Freedom is a package that is really giving people the right to determine their own destinies and the right to evolve in their own way towards an ever freer society in which individuals will always have more and more freedom as they inherit the efforts of previous efforts at freedom. And it certainly does not work by any sort of authoritarian coercion from either inside or outside to so-called impose some kind of economic freedom or some kind of something you would call free markets. It doesn't work that way.
That was a few really good points because, it's neoliberal and libertarian in Swedish. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And so they say the neoliberal policies of the IMF and the World Bank. And I'm a libertarian. I'm against those. I'm not in favor of I want to close down those bodies. So it's always hard for a libertarian to be trying to protect and argue in favor of the World Bank and IMF when you're not. It's the left's description of these that are correct. That's incorrect. Okay. Does aid work? Or a more longer version of that question. There are aid skeptics like Dambisa Moyo, for example, who argues that the main reason why Africa is poor is because it has received too much aid. And in the title of your book, you claim that the West's aid has done so much harm to the West. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm asking, is it really correct to say that Africa is poor because of aid? Cannot aid be a negative factor for Africa's development without being the major development factor? Mm-hmm. And related to this is Michael Spence's book, The Next Convergence, where he argues that aid is a red herring for development. That is, it's not very important. It's a sidekick intellectually and factually, but not politically. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And why is it that so aid is a sidekick for development? It's not very important. It's something we should not talk about that much. Mm-hmm. It's not mm-hmm. the main problem, and it's not the main solution. Mm-hmm. How come aid dominates the development agenda so much, given what I just said?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the reason aid dominates, and I actually disagree with Michael Spence. I think aid is very important in the broader scheme of development. Not because I agree with Dambisa Moyo that it's the main cause of Africa's poverty. I think there are plenty of other historical things going on with Africa's poverty. There's history. One thing that development economists never used to realize, but are now starting to realize finally, is history does matter. It does matter that Africa was the one continent targeted most heavily from 3 different directions by the slave trade. There was not only an Atlantic slave trade, there was a cross-Sahara slave trade, there was an Indian Ocean slave trade in East Africa. And this has, lack of freedom in the past generates less freedom in the future. Autocracy in the past generates more autocracy in the future, and Africa has this tragic legacy of violence and autocracy left over from the slave trade. So I think there's lots of other things going on besides just aid. And but where aid does have a damaging effect is in two ways. First, it changes our view of what development is about into something that is easy for us to implement. And by us, who is us? You know, I mean, this word, this sort of plural we is actually thrown out a lot in aid discussions, and it always makes me sort of cringe. You know, like, what must we do to end world poverty? What can we do to help, you know, maternal mothers dying from childbirth in Africa? You know, and the question is, who is we? You know, is it Europeans? Is it Americans? Is it educated, affluent people, you know, with whose skin color is white and not black? You know, there's all kinds of possible uncomfortable definitions of who we mean by we once we start thinking about who is we. But of course, the de facto we is the aid agencies and the NGOs and everyone involved in them. And so what makes their life very easy, and I think also kind of plays to their ideological sympathies, is a very technical view of the world, which is similar to what we were talking about before, that there's just this technical answer to development, and it's just a recipe of technical instructions you just transmit to the developing countries, and you're done. Because that makes aid much easier if you can just say that your aid dollars are going to finance all these tangible things like water purification tablets and bed nets. Now, the reason this is really bad for the development discussion is that this has a profound political effect. What it really winds up doing is really giving a lot of ideological justification for dictators in poor countries. Because if you have the exact technical answer to development, there's no room left for any democratic discussion of what's going to happen. It's already decided by the experts. And so the natural partner of aid agencies who have this technical approach are autocrats on the receiving end. And autocrats also like the technical view of development because it gives them a big role that they can hire experts and implement their plans from the top down for poor countries. Now this stuff really matters because then the aid agencies will give funding to autocrats, and they'll use they invent all these jargon words to try to make it sound nicer than it really is. So one of the favorite jargon words is developmental states. Developmental states, the synonym for that is aid-financed dictator, but but developmental state or benevolent autocrat, that's another one. It's sort of like, you know, just a contradiction in terms. Benevolent autocrat, you know, no autocrat has the incentive to be benevolent. If they're benevolent, they would say, I hereby announce my resignation. That's how I can help you most. You know, that was what a benevolent autocrat would do. And this matters. So, you know, I hate to tarnish the memory of someone who has just left us, but the late Mr. Meles in Ethiopia, the autocrat of Ethiopia, got a lot of aid from many. I don't know about the Swedish Development Agency, but a lot of aid agencies gave Mr. Meles a lot of aid, and they called him a developmental, benevolent autocrat, you know, whatever. Well, here's some of the things that I found out in my interaction with Ethiopians and reading the literature. So one thing Mr. Meles used the aid for was food relief. Well, that's great. You know, we know that there's high probability, there's a lot of malnutrition in Ethiopia. There's risk of famine, so he used it for food relief. That sounds good. Sounds like a perfect technical answer to a technical problem. Lack of food, you give food. Okay? So what's wrong with that? The only problem with that was that according to human rights, a very careful study by Human Rights Watch, Mr. Meles was only giving the food relief to party members who supported his government. And he was systematically starving anyone who did not belong to the party that supported the official party that supported his government. And here's the example, an example that I promised earlier of lack of accountability of aid agencies. So this was exposed in a report by Human Rights Watch that Melis was starving his opposition. And by the way, he's done things that were directly even much worse. You know, there were student demonstrators in the streets in 2005 after a fraudulent election that his army shot down and killed. There's someone that was a personal friend of mine. This is not a personal issue with me, but someone who happened to be a personal friend who was an Ethiopian economist who won one election to be mayor of Addis Ababa and was promptly put in jail and was held in jail for several years, where I think he told me later that he was reading a book by a Columbia professor whose name I don't remember, called The End of Poverty, that praised Mr. Melis as a developmental state, as a benevolent, enlightened leader for all of Africa, the guy who was keeping him in jail. But anyway, adding to a long list of misdeeds, Mr. Melis withheld aid from opposition members. So what happened after this? You would think that exposing something so terrible, such a terrible misuse of aid for something that would do actual harm in Ethiopia and was oppressing the Ethiopian people, the aid agencies would react quickly and withdraw the aid and apologize and make sure it doesn't happen again, right? How many people believe that's what happened? Well, they did do one positive thing. They announced that they would conduct an investigation. They announced that they would look into this matter. They would investigate themselves and find out if this was true, what Human Rights Watch was saying, that Melis was using aid to starve the opposition and and only feed the famine victims who were party members. And then what happened next? The investigation, and this is a part of the reason why aid agencies can get away with this, is we all have limited attention spans. So there was a burst of publicity when the Human Rights Watch report came out. Everybody was paying attention. I was paying attention, and wrote blog posts about this and op-eds and articles in the New York Review of Books and so on. And then I'm ashamed to say, along with everyone else, I stopped paying attention. And I only found out recently that the promise to investigate, which had sort of, taken the sting out of the criticism of the aid agencies, this idea that they would investigate and correct things if they were wrong. It turns out now, I only found this out about a month ago, that in spring of 2011, they quietly dropped their plans to investigate, and there was never any investigation. And it's only when I went back and sort of checked up on that a year later that I realized, a year before I was reading, and I'm supposed to be one of the people paying the most attention, and I missed it. I feel very guilty about that, but I also feel, if I'm trying this hard to keep track of them and I missed it, then lots of other people must have missed it also. And that's why it's so hard to make this system work, because of this kind of lack of accountability. That people are not paying enough attention and caring enough. There are not enough people caring and not enough people paying attention to sort of keep this. So that's why, in this sense, aid is important. It's supported a system in which, my friend, who would have been a very good mayor of Addis Ababa and probably later gone on to be president in a democratic Ethiopia, aid effectively kept him out of power, and aid rewarded an autocrat and helped an autocrat stay in power.
You talk about the lack of accountability in the aid industry and the incentives that they have in the aid industry as well. And following the debate between you and Sachs, but also between you and the rest of the aid industry. You've been facing an enormous machinery of hundreds of people who've been paid to show that you're wrong. How does it feel?
I'm flattered.
I'm trying to. They are PR people, communicators, and as well as scholars. You talk about publication bias in your book, and how there, and data mining and so on. That there is a serious problem with the self-interest of the aid industry itself. And my question is it possible at all to have a rational commonsensical, scientifically based development and aid debate at all, given the institutional circumstances?
Well, it's certainly true the aid debate is very politicized, and I think it's politicized in not such an obvious way, so it makes it very hard to correct the political distortions that are caused in the aid debate. So I think this relates to your earlier question, why does aid have such a high profile? Well, I think it's, again, because of this us word. It involves us, involves all of us in this room, and assigns us a lot of importance. And the other view that people mainly develop themselves by their own efforts and by their own struggle for greater freedom, that doesn't give us a starring role. And so that's one of the fundamental political realities about the aid debate is people like to think that aid does good and is a critical element in making poor people rich, because we're the stars, if that's the story. We are all of us who care about aid and about development, about poverty, and work on these things. We become the stars, and we like stories in which we're the stars, as opposed to stories in which, we're the butler number 9 on the, on the cast list, and nobody remembers who they are. Obviously I think that is a far more consequential political bias than anything to do with left versus right or any of that. I think it's just the desire for us to be the star in this drama, global drama of poverty. Now, of course, I'm not saying that I'm not going so far as to say that all activity and all caring about the world's poor are driven by that kind of exaggerated self-importance. I very much salute and encourage and respect the compassion that people do have for the world's poor. That is reality. It is tragic that babies are dying from dehydration due to diarrhea for lack of a 10-cent packet of salts that would have saved their lives, oral rehydration salts. It's tragic that babies are dying from measles for lack of a 50-cent measles vaccination shot. So, I completely, like I said, the critics of aid have the same objectives as the advocates of aid. We all want the same thing, and the compassion thing is real, and I'm glad that so many young people have gotten involved in the cause of fighting global poverty and are not just involved in the worst kind of narcissism is the one in which you don't care about anyone besides yourself. The kind of very minor narcissism in which you care about others but you want to have a starring role in rescuing them, that's a lot better. I like that a lot better. And I really salute the compassion. I really want to make that very clear. I'm not at all discouraging the kind of compassion and caring and activity that's oriented towards fighting global poverty. This is all great. Let's just find a better way to channel it so it doesn't do harm and it does good, and it reinforces, it helps people help themselves rather than giving us the starring role, but we can feel good that we're helping other people help themselves.
Okay. I want to ask you a question about the transformative or the marginal approach to foreign aid. I mean, the World Bank has a motto, a world free of poverty, and there's like dozens of UN declarations. The one is more grandiose than the other about how we all hold our hands and we're going to combat poverty and so on. And a couple of years ago, you wrote a paper called Can the West Save Africa? I think this paper came after your book.
Yeah.
And you suggest a distinction between the transformative approach, the grandiose save the world approach, and a marginal approach, which is do good for individuals. What do you mean by that? And can this approach save aid?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem with aid is simply that it's trying to do too much. And this is, related to the things that I've just talked about, that the realistic limit, given the lack of political incentives, given the lack of local knowledge about the problems of poor people, the limits of what can be done are just not that great. The possibilities of what can be done are just not so great as to totally transform a poor society into a rich one. And the more you try to make it a transformative effort, the more likely you are to actually start doing harm, because then you think, oh, I do have to support the dictator and their grand plan to end poverty, because that's the only hope of transformation. You know, the reality is that most social change is not some gigantic transformation engineered from the top down. I'm not saying it never is, but most of the time it's evolutionary. It's one step at a time. You know, it's like it's like a romance. You know, romances work much better if they're gradual than if they're one step at a time. You know, when I met my wife, when she was not yet my wife, it would not have worked out that well if on our first meeting I said, "You're beautiful, will you marry me?" She would have run in the other direction as fast as possible. That's sort of the equivalent of World Bank aid, you know, shock therapy, transform the whole country, end poverty overnight. You know, shock therapy just doesn't, gradualism just works much better in most human activities. And that's true of social change as well. You know, that you take one, the way our sort of, it's not like it's that there's a feasible utopia out there just waiting for us to implement. No one has ever found such a feasible utopia that can be implemented overnight. What people have actually found are these sort of messy, free societies that respond to problems one at a time. You know, when there's one really bad problem, like the financial crisis afflicting Western countries now, you know, we put our energy on that, try to fix that. At another point in time, you know, there was the civil rights tragedy in the U.S. that was, in the end, there was a tremendous amounts of energy, but in the end it was a gradual revolution, a very heroic, idealistic, but gradual revolution towards civil rights for African Americans in the U.S. through, you know, very idealistic leaders like Martin Luther King. I have a dream, and there's lots of, you know, the ideals can sound transformatory. That's fine. I have dreams and transformatory ideals too. I also dream of a world without poverty. We all do. But you know, when you get to actually making change happen, it has to happen one step at a time. You know, Martin Luther King didn't ask instantly for you know, that there be an equal amount of blacks and whites in every corporation, in every government office, everywhere, all over the land, overnight, instantly. He campaigned first for ending segregation on buses, and then he campaigned for ending segregation on lunch counters, and then he campaigned for voting rights. And you know, it's the same thing with the struggle for women's rights in the U.S. It's this one step at a time approach that is the sort of history-proven approach for social change. And so, you know, why should it be any different for poor countries? And people sometimes say this is a pessimistic view. I think it's very pessimistic about the abilities of autocrats to do violent things to, you know, make the women they meet marry them overnight. That would, you know, but I think it's actually optimistic about the potential for all of us to affect change. Because the good thing about sort of decentralized gradual change that's not from some top-down transformative plan, you know, the top-down transformative plan, there's only one planner driving everything. In the bottom-up sort of evolutionary gradual change, all of us are agents of change. You know, you can decide this, and the best thing you can do if you care about development is decide to specialize as much as possible in one specific problem, one specific place, and just work on that, become an expert on that, and, you know, try to affect change in that place. And a million other people will be doing that in other places, and that's how change happens. So I think that's actually a hopeful plan, because you have a lot more. There's a lot more hope for the payoff to what you do in this view of the world than in the sort of planned, top-down, transformative view of the world.
Let me run by you the official formulation of the Swedish aid policy, which I think is much better than the UN's or the World Bank's. And I just translated it here, so the State Secretary for Foreign Aid says they should have to correct me. To contribute to creating conditions for poor people to improve their living conditions. do you think it's a better formulation than a world free of poverty?
It sounds more modest.
Yeah. Okay.
Sounds very sweet.
Okay. Okay. One last. Very Swedish. Yeah, we're not very grandiose, are we? One last question. Since I've been following your writings for years, you've been using humor, irony, sarcasm in your writing. I mean, on your blog and on Twitter and so on. Very skillfully, I must say. It's always like, what is Bill going to write today? So it's like, and it's a very efficient and effective sort of communication, and I'm very jealous of that. But I always wanted to ask you, is this a strategic choice or just something you do because you are such a person?
Certainly not a strategic choice. You just
because if I were your PR consultant, I would say, "Go on. This is the way you should do it."
I think it sort of comes naturally, not because of any abilities whatsoever, but just I think you have to find a way to adapt to a world in which you're criticizing the establishment view. I really believe in the role of dissenters, and I really respect other dissenters, most of whom sacrifice a lot more than I ever have for the right to dissent. Dissenters are really important corrective individuals for establishments that are too prone to kind of congratulate themselves and engage in groupthink. And so the role of a dissenter is to say, the groupthink is wrong, which is pretty much the same as saying everyone else is wrong. and you don't make yourself real popular by saying everyone else is wrong. And so you have to psychologically adapt, and I think one sort of protective mechanism that not only I but many other critics have is sort of humor, because if you can say everyone else is wrong, everyone will go away very angry. But if you can sort of say everyone else is wrong in some entertaining way that disarms them, then maybe you have a chance to get past their defenses and say, you're not such a bad person after all. You may be totally wrong, but there's hope for you. What is the process of education? Education is all about new viewpoints replacing mistaken viewpoints. That's what education is about. So, all that critics are doing is uncovering kind of layers of mistaken approaches and replacing them with suggestions for better approaches. And that it's hard to convince people that they need to be educated in things that they think that they've already resolved. But actually, all of us need more education. I think, what I'm saying now is different from what I was saying 2 years ago, because things have changed. I realized I was wrong in some areas and had to change myself. I think another reason that humor is an important psychological adaptation is that one person I criticize a lot, in fact, a lot more than is healthy, is myself. That I realize I do a lot of things that are mistakes in retrospect, and I have to correct them. So this philosophy of sort of criticism and correction and dissent and change, I think it's something I recommend. No, I don't recommend criticizing yourself too much. It's not really psychologically healthy, and you'll be happier if you don't. But I think it's a worldview that you should be willing to consider, at least at the intellectual level. That we always start with a view of the world that must be at least partially wrong to begin with, and we're looking for we're going to try to listen to as many people as possible who we think might possibly give us a better way to look at the world. That's sort of the same process that I went through in my career, and it's at times been painful. It's also intellectually exciting, that you learn new things. You realize that, it's like in a murder mystery, the guy that you think was the murderer turns out not to be the murderer, and it's someone else. It's kind of fun and exciting when you find out new things, and that's one reason why I recommend the critical approach to aid very much to all of you.
Okay, let's open up the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Please say who you are, your name, and your affiliation, if any.
My name is Jacob Lundberg. I do a PhD in economics. In the last 20 years or so, we've seen... Sorry again?
So do I.
In the past 20 years or so, we've seen poverty being cut approximately in half, people living under $1 a day, while hunger has stayed approximately stagnant, people living on less than 2,000 calories a day. Do you have a theory as to why this is the case?
Well, another bit of very unwelcome news that I sometimes have to deliver is a lot of these numbers that we cite, like what you've just cited. I mean, you're not personally responsible for the statistics that you cite. You're citing authorities that should know what they're saying. And the sad news is the authorities that we often cite for these numbers turn out to be basing their numbers on not much of anything. The reality is that these stylized facts are just not that well pinned down. To give you an example, the hunger number, the way that the only real data that there is on hunger is there's some statistics for some countries on two different dimensions of hunger, whether children are way too little for their height, whether their weight for their height is too low. And the other is whether the height for their age is too low. So these are the only two real data points that we have for any country on hunger. And actually those are available for a surprisingly small number of countries. There just aren't that many countries that have good enough data. And so where are the global hunger numbers coming from when the real data is so sparse? They're actually pretty much made up by the UN using highly questionable models that extrapolate from other models, which extrapolate from other models, and they're really based in the end on not much of anything. So I'm very hesitant to explain trends that may turn out to be completely fictitious. I think the reliable data that you can look at is just, as much as possible, try to identify some reliable sources at as disaggregated a level as possible, and then do your own averages over those things that you judge to be reliable. If you do that, it certainly is true that the big picture is simply that both poverty and hunger are going down in the long run. And they may not be going down at exactly the same rate because, and this is another one of the myths of development, is that development is this one-dimensional process that can be measured by this thing that we call development, which could be GDP per capita, or it could be the Human Development Index, which is just an average of life expectancy, education, and GDP per capita. But development is not one-dimensional, so there could be faster progress in one area than the other, and there would not be much of a story about that other than to say that progress is always uneven. The important thing is the thing that you said at the beginning, that there is progress. And so despite, and I'm glad you raised that, because that's another hopeful message that I want to make sure that I leave you all with, is that despite the failings that I've described of the aid business, the good news is that development is happening anyway. And the starring actors are not the aid agencies, because the evidence does not support any sort of starring role for the aid agencies in this, for development to be happening. It's not happening in countries that are most aid intensive, for example. But development is happening, and the stars of this are not the aid agencies. They're the poor people themselves who are agitating for their own greater rights, who are starting new businesses and employing other people, finding new activities in which to earn more income, working very hard, educating their children, sometimes immigrating to rich countries and then re-immigrating to where they came from to take back valuable lessons they learned in the North to the South. This is how development is happening in process. So again, is this a hopeful message or a pessimistic message? It's really a question of who are you pessimistic about and who you're hopeful about. I'm very pessimistic about aid agencies and autocrats, very hopeful about poor individuals to help themselves. And with the other side is the reverse. They're very pessimistic about these poor, helpless victims who can't help themselves and that need, Bono to come rescue them. That's the so-called optimistic view. I don't like that optimistic view in that form.
Okay. Question over there, yeah.
Okay, my name is Mats Felt, and my main qualification for posing a question is that I once was a political assistant to the Secretary of Foreign Affairs. She was mainly known for having a brother who could have paid for the foreign assistance money himself. He also owned all the TV channels. That helped sometimes. But serious question. You mentioned Ethiopia. The left always have their darling countries. Used to be Ethiopia and China, and the aid agencies, they also have their darling countries. And Ethiopia has been one of them. Uganda was one for a while. And one of them right now, as far as I can picture the debate, is Rwanda. Can you have some comment on that? Democracy is evidently not what they succeed with in Rwanda. But the rest of the picture, is he doing more or less well on development, or is that also a developmental state?
Yeah,
Thanks.
well, Kagame is an autocrat, and he does all the standard autocratic things, is violating individual liberties, jailing people, assassinating people, sending armies into neighboring Democratic Republic of the Congo to do very violent things, including war crimes. So this is, you can't cover over the reality of who autocrats are. They are autocrats. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think some things are going well in Rwanda in terms of, and going well in the sense of a positive change. And that's, I think, one misconception that makes us give too much credit to autocrats is that when we see a period of high economic growth or other kinds of positive change like high economic growth happening under an autocrat, we give all the credit to the autocrat. We call him a benevolent autocrat, and that's what's happening with Kagame in Rwanda, and that's why Rwanda is being given a lot of aid under that illusion. Of course, partly when you have sort of a positive change, there are two ways to have a positive change. You can have the end point be really high, or you can have the beginning point be really low. Of course, what was happening in Rwanda is you had one of the most cataclysmic tragedies of all time, the genocide, which was, of course, had gigantic economic consequences, destroyed the economy, as well as the human tragedy of the genocide, the individual genocide victims. And then, what typically happens after a cataclysm is there's recovery. People start rebuilding their lives, they start rebuilding capital, and the economy recovers. So that's probably most of what is going on in Rwanda. And a lot of these kind of high growth episodes, it's the same with China. Everyone is so admiring of the Chinese party autocrats because China has rapid growth. Well, they had rapid growth because an earlier generation of autocrats had so destroyed China that all they had to do was just kind of remove some of the most tyrannical disasters like the Great Famine and the Cultural Revolution and just not do that anymore. And you had this wonderfully entrepreneurial Chinese diaspora that was all over Asia and linked to a lot of the success stories like Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan and Indonesia and Malaysia. And they all started pouring money back into China once you just sort of announced, okay, we're not going to do anything too totalitarian from now on. We're just going to be regular dictators and keep things kind of normal, and you can invest here. And that's, bang, you get a period of very rapid growth. Again, growth is a change from, something very bad to something not as bad. And that's not enough reason to sort of convert from belief in kind of individual liberty and human rights to a belief in worshiping autocrats. That's not enough. That's not good enough. I would hang on to your ideals and not give, not admire autocrats and not finance autocrats.
Okay, there's a question down there. Oh.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Nicholas Ehlert. I'm also a PhD student.
You got a haircut. Sorry, I didn't recognize
you. Actually I did. I'm also a PhD student in economics. I was thinking about your recommendation that all of us, we who want to sort of change the world, that we specialize on sort of a small problem. And I appreciate that that's probably a good idea, since it would probably take you a couple of lifetimes before you even began to actually understand how to improve something like that. But still, I was sort of thinking about the risk of, in that case, losing out on sort of the macro, the big picture in that sense. I mean, say my dentist, for example, is always extremely well, adamant that I brush my teeth all the time and all of that. Don't eat any candy and so forth. And I'm like, well, but I have other things to care about as well, sort of like having fun and so forth. But let's say, well, externalities of some sort of crowding out issues. So I was thinking if you could, perhaps.
Well, I mean, there's one specialized niche is people who talk about the big picture, which I'm apparently part of. And there's that, and then the reason we can each of us specialize is that is then we exchange with each other the ideas. So the people who specialize in talking more about the macro stuff can kind of give you the bottom line on a bunch of stuff that you need to know for your specialized area, and each of us do that. So that's one of the great miracles of development, is it's a process that's based on specialization and exchange. And that happens both at not only in the standard theory of trade, but also at the intellectual level. The reason that we've made so much progress at the intellectual level in science and other areas is precisely this process of specialization and exchange of ideas. So that's what you can become part of.
Sorry for cutting in, but I have to ask you one short question. I mean, you talked about shock therapy before, and that was Jeff Sachs was behind shock therapy. Then it was the enemy of the left, and now he's the aid promoter par préférence, and now he's the darling of the left. Has he changed, or has the left changed?
Well, I think his career kind of illustrates that the sort of left-right dichotomy is not so simple. It's not that easy to say what's on the left and what's on the right.
Sure.
I think this sort of like, I was actually working on Russia at the same time that he was promoting shock therapy in Russia. And I confess, like I said, I've made mistakes and had to correct things myself. I initially believed in shock therapy at the time that I was first working on Russia in the early 90s. And it was really only by sort of the bitter experience of the way things turned out and convincing arguments of other people that I got persuaded this was a mistake. And at the time, there was this phrase that was kind of jokingly passed around that Sachs sort of believed in, sort of Lenin's approach to markets. That he was going to be sort of Lenin imposing markets. And so there is this paradox that you have sort of a left-wing attitude towards the possibility for kind of a revolutionary vanguard to totally change society, combined with what is usually seen as kind of a right-wing agenda of a free market, and you can get very strange combinations of these two things. So left and right is not so easy.
Okay, thanks. Anders?
Hi, my name is Anders Gustafsson. I'm an economist working at the Treasury Department. I have kind of similar question about this top-down imposing of markets. What do you say about examples from, let's say, Chile or Malaysia or most of the Southeastern Asian countries? I mean, General Parker in South Korea and so on. Aren't those examples of successful imposing of markets from the top-down autocratic way, which led to results that perhaps the dictator didn't want, but they led to promotion, for example, Pinochet in Chile and so on?
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it does work. By coincidence, perhaps, but aren't those examples of sometimes it works?
Yeah, so, this is a question that I'm trying hard to persuade people on, but it's very hard to make this case. So I'm gonna predict two things. I'm gonna make a completely logical, airtight case that what you just said is wrong, and you're not going to believe me. So, and not only that, I'm going to tell you why you don't believe me. So, actually, the evidence that the sort of autocrats that were in power at the time of this rapid growth get the credit for the rapid growth and get the credit for the sort of the booming of exports that happened in these countries, in Chile and in Korea. It's, what is that evidence? Why do we know that it's the autocrat rather than other things that were going on? And of course, we would, we need something plausible else to be going on that could explain that. I think something that I already mentioned, I think, is another plausible story for at least part of what was going on in those cases. So what you have this strange concentration of these success stories. We treat them as like individual success stories featuring heroic autocrats, but they have these strange cultural links. So Korea was a traditional trading partner of the overseas Chinese diaspora. And by the way, it's even more interesting than that. It turns out the Chinese diaspora have been migrating for centuries, ever since the 13th century, and primarily from southwest China, especially one province called Fujian, which is just opposite of Taiwan. In fact, Taiwan itself is settled by mainly Fujianese migrants, even before Chiang Kai-shek got there. And so these guys have been migrating all over East Asia for centuries and forming these trading networks. And then this great boom in world trade comes along, and great advances in technology come along, and here's this kind of ready-made, already flourishing trading network, ready to be plugged into the great global system that is industrializing and globalizing. And so all of these places do well. And so Korea does well, Taiwan does well, Singapore does well, and they all happen to have had these autocrats in power at the time they did well. Well, why were autocrats in power? Well, they were low-income countries. Most low-income countries have autocrats in power. So, it's not at all clear to me that the autocrats deserve the credit as opposed to some other, non-autocrat explanation for kind of things happening not even necessarily at a national level, but at a regional level. That explains this amazing concentration of success in East Asia. That it's East Asia and places that were historically very linked to each other by trade and cultural networks. And also, of course, including Japan as part of this picture, was also another traditional trading partner of this network. And Japan's industrialization certainly had a lot to do with what happened in the others also. So we think of things in individual terms that are really things that are not even happening at the national level, they're really happening at the regional level. Now, I predicted you won't believe me, and I don't know if my prediction is true or not, but let me tell you why you don't believe me. We have a hard time, all of us, including me, with stories that feature these kind of vague historical forces like, trading diasporas who are the, Fujianese migrants from the last several centuries. We have a hard time. We much prefer stories in which there's a hero. And, having a story in which there's a hero like the autocrat we just instinctively prefer that story to the story without a hero, in which there's sort of the creative efforts of many unknown anonymous traders get the credit. And in fact, this bias is so strong in all of us that psychologists have done experiments with this and have established something called leadership attribution bias. Mm-hmm. So one of the typical experiments is they take two groups and put them in kind of rooms with windows where the true test subjects of the psychologists are the people observing these two groups. And in the two groups, they hang a little sign around one of the members of each group saying leader. And this person is completely randomly chosen and does absolutely nothing. The experiment is very carefully designed that the leader does absolutely nothing, has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on in the group. And then, the two groups perform at some task. I don't remember the exact task in this experiment, but they perform at some task, and one of them winds up doing better. Then they ask the subjects, why did that one group do better? Oh, that one leader was so good at rallying people around him, and the other leader was so divisive and argumentative, and the first successful leader, well, they were so inspirational and they were handsome, and the other one was kind of ugly, and people just invent these elaborate rationalizations. And what's even more fascinating is they've done this test even when they tell people that the leaders were chosen at random and do nothing. Even when they tell people this, they still invent these kind of leader rationalization stories, because that's how we like our stories. That's why Hollywood movies are made about individual heroes and not about 1 million Fujianese traders achieving heroic deeds. So that's the problem that as economists we struggle with, is that we really are dealing with phenomena that often don't have heroes, that have a million heroes, not one hero. And we face a great barrier against people's natural storytelling preferences when we try to tell these stories.
Let me ask you another question that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Migration. You mentioned it briefly, but migration for development. I mean, just look at the numbers, because there's a lot of publications out there saying that free or freer migration from rich to poor, from poor to rich countries can actually add a lot to the global economy, and it's probably the best tool we in the West have to save the rest. I mean, Land Pritchett wrote the book a couple of years ago. Michael Clemens is doing this project over at Center for Global Development and so on. There's publications popping up in there, here and there, and somehow people is the lagger in development. I mean, comparing how capital, goods, and services are moving around the world, people cannot move as freely, and they don't move as much either. Given your marginal approach thinking, how do you view this? Do you think that in the future we're going to talk much more about migration for development? And is it an effective tool, efficient and effective tool?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of Michael Clemens's and Land Pritchett's work. And, they do make a convincing case that migration is a great sort of win-win opportunity for, I hate that phrase win-win because it's overused dramatically to apply to situations that are often lose-lose, but it really is a big opportunity for both sides, because a poor person is deciding to move because they figure, if it's for purely economic reasons, that they figure that they can get better, they can be more productive somewhere else, and being more productive gets higher income. And then so the world economy as a whole is better off when someone moves from being less productive to being more productive. So everybody wins. Now, I will throw in the caveat that I think you were hinting at by saying gradualism. Now, does that mean, we should open the floodgates and, 1 billion people should be allowed into Sweden? Obviously that would be a gigantic disruption, and any believer in kind of sensible gradualism cannot recommend something like that. And I'm certainly not qualified to discuss Sweden's immigration situation, but I think we have to accept as a political reality that people are attached to a certain culture, and that they will resist too much, whether we think it's good or not as individuals. The political reality in rich countries is that there is a large constituency that is attached to a sort of homegrown culture that they feel will be threatened by too large an influx that happens too fast at once of migrants. So that's a preference that needs, we should not ignore that entirely as economists. I mean, as economists, we're supposed to be, if we believe in freedom, then we're supposed to be allowing people to express their preferences. Now, this one is more complicated because this is a preference that involves restricting someone else's freedom. And so this is not, and this is why I'm not an ideologue, and that I don't believe that there's an airtight, easy answer to every question. I don't think there's any easy answer to this question. There's just trade-offs. There's people who do prefer something that could be threatened by a gigantic influx of people from another culture, including, cultures that have values that might be anti-liberty, anti-freedom. So there's that issue. But at the same time, I think some of these fears are, again, I don't know about Sweden, but in the US, I think some of these fears are often exaggerated, and that there is a certain part of people who are really expressing fears that are based more on kind of stereotypes and racism that are not so much based on reality. Because, first of all, the idea that there would be a gigantic flood if you eliminated restrictions ignores the fact that most people do want to stay at home. You know, not everyone wants to just pick up and move to a rich country. Most people do want to stay at home. So the flood is not going to be as great as people often fear that it will be or would be. And second, the process of assimilation historically has been shown to be quite fast. And so the idea that the homegrown cultural values that you prefer are kind of drastically threatened by an inflow of people from another culture, I think the historical record just does not support pressing the panic button on that one. You know, but again, all of this is subject to the caveat that let things happen gradually. Don't expect, certainly, just like with, you know, the idea of imposing a free market by a planner, you don't want some world planner to impose free migration on everyone else. You know, that would be a disaster. It has to evolve gradually and evolution in a kind of evolutionary gradual way that people come to accept this movement, that the world would be a better place with more movement and less national restrictions.
My last question would be on something you mentioned briefly. You said you're not an ideologue, but you have been portrayed and you've been attached to certain ideological circles, so to say, given your writings. But how would you characterize your ideology?
I think I try very hard not to have an ideology. I think, you know, I think, again, just sort of repeating something I said very briefly, an ideology is really sort of an all-encompassing set of beliefs that sort of claims to resolve every possible problem in kind of a closed way, that you have kind of like an ideology is something that enables you to give a snap answer to every question, every policy question. You know, well, the answer to this is this, the answer to this is this. And it's a very oversimplified view of the world in which there's, you know, usually only one goal. There's usually only one bad guy and only one good guy. And, you know, you're always condemning the bad guy and always praising the good guy to attain the only one goal. And, you know, life is more complex. There are people that are in between good and evil. There are more goals than one. There are trade-offs. You know, life is messy. And so, you know, I believe in ideals rather than an ideology. I believe in ideals like, you know, individuals' right to choose for themselves, individuals' right to dignity. And that's one thing that is something we haven't talked about today, but upsets me a lot about the kind of view of the helpless victims, the sort of passive, emaciated, the pictures of the starving babies with the swollen bellies. You know, this is really robbing poor families of their dignity. You know, that when you portray such extreme stereotypes and then you portray Africa stereotypically, you know, like that child, that's robbing people of their dignity, and that's something I certainly feel strongly about. And, you know, just the worth of human people, of human persons, that's the core ideal, which just means that, you know, you have the right not to have other people force you to do things unless, you know, things that are very necessary for the common good, like, you know, pay for lighthouses or, you know, subways or whatever. But, you know, that people have the right to make their own choices, the right to you know, belong to, and not in a sort of selfish, individualistic way, but that they also have the right to belong to the groups that they want to belong to. Be they ethnic or religious or family-oriented or whatever. It's not that this ideal of the worth of the human individual is some kind of egoistic, altruistic, kind of hedonistic, you know, pleasure thing. It's that the worth of the individual means the individual chooses most of the time to associate a lot with other individuals in very tight family and social networks, and that's part of what makes us human. So I think that a lot of the stereotypes that people associate with certain viewpoints are really not justified. I don't think this viewpoint is either left or right or conservative or liberal. I think it's just a viewpoint that where you state clearly your ideals and then you kind of state your pragmatic beliefs about what will work and what will not work to attain those ideals. I think that's the way to think about the world.
To me, sounds like a classical liberal minus Rand.
Anyway,
anyway, it was a great pleasure having you here.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. Thank you very much.
Here's a small bottle and a notebook with from Timbro.
Wow. Wow. Thank you very much.
Thanks all for coming. And